What is up, guys? Rick Cactus here. Thank you so much for stopping by, and today we are going to be talking about The Division 2, and this is a really interesting discussion because when The Division 2 released, it was hailed as the most amazing loot-based game this world has ever seen. People were saying that all other loot-based games should be based upon the foundations The Division 2 is laying. We've done it, guys! We found the pinnacle of this genre. And now, no one's playing the game. Well, not no one, but certainly The Division 2 has fallen off so substantially. It recently got its first kind of episode 1 big hit of content, and overwhelmingly the community's reaction was, this is underwhelming, this isn't enough to bring me back. That's something I saw all over the place, on Twitter, everywhere, from other Division YouTubers, everyone saying, yeah, this isn't enough to bring me back, this isn't enough to get me interested again. So what the heck happened? Because honestly, the same thing happened with me. I played, enjoyed The Division 2, and I'm not making this video to purely just hate on The Division 2 or anything like that. In fact, if someone was to ask me, hey, should I buy The Division 2? I think overall, my answer would still have to be yes. You are going to get hundreds of hours of entertainment, if not close to that, before you kind of hit the problems and the walls we're going to talk about in this video. But those problems and those walls are still there, and they should be discussed. So, again, what the heck happened? Because the Division 2 launch was so good, and it was, and things were going pretty darn well up until World Tier 5. Before that point, things were looking pretty good. The leveling system was quite fair and actually was a pretty big departure from games like Destiny 2. There wasn't that much RNG involved when you were leveling up. You pretty much always got gear a little bit higher than what you were, and the leveling process felt refreshingly smooth for this type of game. And then once you were kind of leveled up to the max level, you could experiment more with builds and so on. This is kind of where the problems started to arise. I don't think anyone realized how big of a problems they were, but the thing was, by the time you were at the end game, The Division 2 was throwing loot at you. Everything was the gold high-end rarity, and it made things a little overwhelming, to be honest, and that didn't count the fact that so much of the loot you were getting was useless. That's a problem that would be accelerated later on, but it was kind of a frustrating thing when you would get loot after loot after loot piece, and you would do mission after mission after mission, and you were looking for very specific roles, or even just specific guns, or even just specific brands for your armor. You didn't have to be looking for something extremely specific, and it was still kind of a frustrating process to acquire what you actually wanted. Now, this certainly wasn't the worst thing in the world, and generally, leading up to World Tier 5, people did throw together some builds they felt comfortable with and were doing very well with in the end game. However, at the same time, when you're looking at the variety of builds, there was also some problems emerging. Right off the bat, skill builds were essentially impossible to create. They were balanced incredibly poorly, like you had to have so many skill points just to get minor bonuses. It was absolutely ridiculous, and so that didn't help anyone who wanted to cater their playstyle in that way, that those builds were basically inaccessible for the first portion of the game. That was not great. But things were still generally positive again until World Tier 5. So what happened there? World Tier 5 was hailed as the next big step for the game. It introduced a brand new stronghold with tidal basin, and it introduced gear sets back into the Division 2. Coming from the Division 1, gear sets were the most desirable, most awesome piece of loot you could possibly get. Grinding for those 6-piece classified gear sets was the entire endgame during the last portion of the Division 1, and it was a fantastic grind. The rewards were awesome, so expectations were very high, especially because the power level of pretty much all of the classified sets from the Division 1 were up there, and all of them had endgame viable builds. But this is one of the main failings of the Division 2, and I think this really killed a lot of interest in the game. All of the gear sets sucked when they were introduced. Seriously, all of them. The Patriot set, the Hardwired set, all of that stuff sucked. Now, they've since been buffed and are a bit more usable, but when you have this big introduction of new content and the introduction of a new rarity tier, which is a huge deal, and they all are not really viable in the end game, and they're all outclassed by the lower rarity, that is not good. Just imagine, guys, if Destiny 2 had launched with no exotic gear whatsoever, and then the first big update we got introduced for the first time exotics into the game, and they all sucked. Can you imagine what a punch to the morale, what a punch to the hype behind this game that would do? And that's exactly what happened in the Division 2. The main piece of loot you were supposed to chase with this new endgame world tier was undesirable. And that created a lot of problems because apparently the developers thought it was fine, and as a result of that, all of World Tier 5 was built around you acquiring this gear. Every single mission, every single endgame activity pretty much, all boasted set gear as their rewards. This was definitely supposed to be the carrot on the stick you were chasing in the endgame of the Division 2, but the carrot was rotten, and so that killed so much hype for the game. It's also around this point that there was some pretty substantial balancing changes, but problematically, like I said earlier, you spent a lot of time crafting your build because the game throws so much loot at you, it's hard to get what you want. Eventually, after hours and hours and hours of grinding the game, you would put together a build, and then the developers would decide that that build that you put together is overpowered in the Dark Zone. It doesn't matter if you don't play the Dark Zone, it was overpowered in the Dark Zone, and it would be nerfed pretty substantially. So that build you spent hours and hours grinding for was useless, and you had to start again from scratch pretty much. And that also had another issue because honestly, there was always, in my opinion, a lack of inventory space for how much loot they were throwing at you. And so it meant that you couldn't really have too many builds that you were trying to create. You really only had one or two builds that you could have, you know, the proper armor for that you could be trying to get. And so if your main build suddenly became useless, you didn't really have a backup build. You literally didn't even have the space for a couple of backup builds. So that created issues as well. Also, remember the painless, awesome leveling that was in the first initial stretch of the game? Well, that was completely taken away with World Tier 5. Now, sometimes you'd get loot that was under what you are, sometimes over, but often under. Once you reach that threshold of 500 gear score, you would often be getting lower gear score gear, and even if it was only 497, for example, you knew that because it's 497, it didn't have the damage numbers that weapon, for example, was capable of, and there was better gear out there. It was definitely a little bit depressing. But in fairness to the Division 2, it kept trucking along with new content, and often this new content was pretty darn good. When a new specialist was introduced with the guy with the minigun, phenomenal, just because it's a lot more variety in the game. However, there was some slight problems with the introduction of that as well, because when you pick a new specialist and you're at World Tier 5, let's say, you have to play that guy and level him up to increase the damage of the specialist weapon. Now, this is a problem because it means that when you unlock a new specialist for the first time and you're doing missions with it, it's going to suck. Like, its specialist ability is going to do basically nothing until you've leveled up the damage of it. And I'm not sure that's the best approach. Like, for example, in Destiny, when you're unlocking new subclasses, new supers, the super itself is going to be powerful, and then you can augment it and unlock new abilities and so on, but you don't really want to mess with that key super ability. This is combined with the fact that after the launch of the game, they felt like people were getting way too much specialist ammo, and so they nerfed the crap out of that. Now, when you play a mission, you may only find one brick the entire mission to use your specialist weapon. and that's a little disappointing. It certainly can make things pretty easy when you have an abundance of specialist ammo, but like utilizing those grenade launchers, utilizing the minigun, utilizing the 50 cal was so much fun, and so pretty substantial nerfs to that did ruin the enjoyment in a certain aspect, especially if, again, you're staying out of those PvP zones. As usual, the Division is having a pretty hard time balancing its PvP with its PvE. But then that brings us to the recent introduction of kind of the episode 1 of new content. We get areas like the zoo, and while these areas look extremely cool and the developers have done an unbelievable job at staying true to the Washington, D.C. area that the game takes place, the problem is that as you play the game more and as these content drops have hit the game and as we've gotten more missions, they feel so incredibly similar. And I think this is another big problem why people are leaving the game and they come back and they try it out for a bit and they leave the game again. It's because you add the new zoo mission and it doesn't even feel different than any other mission. If you look at a game like Destiny 2, you have different PvE activities that feel drastically different from one another. Strikes feel very different from Reckoning, which feels very different from the Menagerie. All those activities have a unique flair to them and they feel different when you play them. In the Division 2, however, all the missions feel incredibly similar. It's basically like an entire game of strikes, and those bigger stronghold levels, well, they're basically 3 strikes stacked on top of each other. You play, boss fight. Play, boss fight. Kill normal enemies, boss fight. Those are the bigger missions, and the normal missions are just play, boss fight. That's really all there is to it, and there's a severe lack of interesting gameplay designs and mechanics within the game. You are playing the same level in a different area over and over and over, at least it feels like. Now, I will say how you play changes pretty dramatically, and the feeling of what you play changes pretty dramatically when you crank up that difficulty. But that's kind of another problem in and of itself, is that when World Tier 5 introduced all these crazy different difficulties like heroic difficulty, there was absolutely zero reason to do those increased difficulties. Because heroic, it basically gave you one more piece of high-end gold gear. That was literally it. Can you imagine that? You are going to take 20 more minutes or however extra time to do this mission because it is substantially harder. It is very intense and I liked that difficulty, but the practical rewards are absolutely absent. There's nothing when World Tier 5 launched that you could only get for doing that new heroic rarity, and it just completely killed interest in that rarity. Like, why was it balanced like that? And the last thing that really killed it for me was exotic weapons. Now, exotic weapons in the Division 2 are actually pretty neat in design. I especially like how they have holstered perks. So even if you don't have your exotic weapon out and about and using it, it provides bonuses to the rest of your gear. That's a really cool feature. Love that. And a lot of the exotic weapons are pretty decent in the Division 2. But also, some of them absolutely suck. I'm thinking of the Pestilence LMG when that was introduced. That thing, it was so bad, it had no practical usage, and when you have a new update and you introduce only 2 exotic weapons and one of them sucks, like that's not great. But I think the bigger problem with the exotic weapons is that it almost seems like they looked at what Destiny 2 was doing for exotics and said, okay, let's take the worst aspects of that the community there has complained about and implement it in our game. Seriously. RNG and time gating. That's what people don't really want when going after exotics, and that's what the Division 2 has in droves. For example, the RNG aspect, you have to go and kill specific bosses, but they don't just drop the piece of gear that you need. So it's already a pretty long quest to go and kill all these specific bosses and get all these pieces of gear and put them together and all this stuff. But when you kill a boss, it's not even actually guaranteed to drop that. So you're gonna have to potentially kill a boss 12 times just to get the piece you need to then go kill a different boss 8 times to get that piece. And that's more just time consuming and somewhat frustrating than fun or interesting. Also, time gating. A lot of the exotics were time gated where you could only get like one piece per week, and that's, again, a not super fun thing to do. Not to mention that this created problems where they were such a chore to go and get these exotics that you never really dismantled them, and that meant that you'd get the blueprint for these exotics, and you'd get a bad roll of a certain exotic that you actually liked, like a bad roll on the chatterbox or whatever, and you'd never get to make a new one because you had no exotic materials because you never dismantled them because they're such an annoying process to get. But at the end of the day, I do still believe the foundation of the Division 2 is strong. It's one of those games where they just kept slipping up on these minor things, like the exotics. The exotics inherently are designed pretty decently, it's just the process of getting them could be improved, and that's not that hard of a thing to do in the future, is to implement better ways of getting these exotics, right? And so I do believe the Division 2 pretty easily can improve and pretty easily attract the player base back into the game. And some of the problems I've talked about, like the terrible set gears, again, some of them have been buffed, and so it's not so terrible now when I'm saying this. So they've already improved some of the issues that I have mentioned. So the Division 2 is getting better. It's still pumping out content for free, which is very, very commendable. There's still so much game there. It just needs to kind of get itself back on the tracks when it comes to the end game viability and when it comes to loot, especially being able to not have these heavy-handed nerfs that destroy people's builds, having more inventory space or something of the like, to have more alternative builds ready, and a more forgiving upgrade and crafting system, and potentially even having some sort of infusion system, so if the gear score does increase in the future, you don't have to grind all over again. The grinding process is not great in the Division 2. The process of creating your build is great. There's so much customization, there's so many different stats you have to look at, but if you put all this time into crafting this perfect build and then it's destroyed in an update, that kills your desire to play the game. So they've really got to be careful about doing that in the future. In any event, guys, that's it for the video. That's kind of the reasons I have stopped playing the Division 2. What do you guys think? Why did you stop playing the Division 2? If you are still playing, what new features are you enjoying? Have I said things that they've since fixed that you think I should give another try to? Definitely let me know in the comment section down below. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, please remember to help me out by simply rating and especially sharing this video. And if you guys want to see more content similar to this in the future, don't be afraid to slap that subscribe button. If you guys want to get in touch with me and keep up to date with the latest channel activity, the best way is to follow me on Twitter at RickCactus. That's linked in the description down below. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, have a good day.